But let me just say that I have known David for a very, very great many years, since he was actually a doctoral student at Harvard after having taught school in Philadelphia for several years. We actually emerged from the same undergraduate institution, which does neither of us any particular credit, I guess. But but I didn't know him there because he made the mistake of arriving after I had already left. He has worked in many, many different aspects of early childhood research. When we first worked together, I had sort of conceptualized together with Pat and Tabers the idea of looking at family interactions in low-income families, and David kept pounding on my door and saying, "But you've got to look at the preschool classrooms these kids are in. Don't you know that there might be something going on in the preschool classrooms?" So indeed, we expanded the project to incorporate attention to the preschool classrooms as well as to the home. And that was an enormous enrichment of the project because it made it possible to look at both independent contributions and also distinctive contributions of those two settings. David has taught at, I think, every institution within 40 miles of here. Is that right?
Close. Not Harvard.
Studied or taught at every institution within 40 miles of here, and also worked for a time at EDC, the Education Development Center, where he oversaw a big project on Head Start quality. But now he's at Vanderbilt University, which considers itself very fortunate to have him, and keeps raising his salary every time he gets an offer from someplace else. So that's how much they love him. So I will turn the, and I should say, he worked, part of the reason he's here is because he worked at the U with Judith Schickadance and developed the OWL project, the OWL curriculum, and I guess that's part of what he's going to talk about. Right?
A little bit, yeah, right.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm not sure just how cozy and friendly we are here. I want to tell my first interaction with Catherine Snow. And I think I will. So I was a graduate student at Harvard when Catherine returned from the Netherlands. And I was in an office that had been a research office with Courtney Kasdan that was soon to become Catherine's office. And my first encounter with the esteemed Dr. Catherine Snow, where she came charging up to me and said, "Did you steal my expletive books?" There was a box of books that had gone missing between the Netherlands and Harvard. Oh, this is Catherine Snow. So things only went upwards, only got better from there. So, well, you know, I didn't put my name in them. But we've had wonderful, many opportunities to work together and laugh together, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I was so excited about my opportunity to come here and speak that I have a presentation that has almost every piece of data and idea that I ever had. And so fortunately for you, while Catherine was talking, I decided I'm going to lighten up a little bit and talk a little about some other things. And some of the things that were in this PowerPoint, I'm not going to get to. So if Renata, if you have a PowerPoint that I don't talk about, that's the way it will be. So I think I will start with a little background here, since there's been this is quite relevant to what you were talking about, Catherine. Let's see. I want to go. How do I do page up in this thing? There we go. I got it. So I know that there's been a fair amount of talk about the Boston Public Schools and the wonderful success that they're having. And one element of that success, I really think, is the use of the curriculum, opening the world of learning, better known as OWL. And I decided, sort of as sort of an extended response to Catherine's ruminations and discussion, to talk in a little bit of detail about the structure of that curriculum, because just because someone looks at a curriculum and sees a series of pages with activities doesn't necessarily make evident the thinking that's gone into it. And I think it's particularly relevant in response to the kinds of things that Catherine was talking about earlier. And it'll help set me up for where I'm going to go with some of my comments as I move on. So this is OWL, how it works. It has thematically integrated topics. Each of them are a month long. And in those topics, there are a set of storybooks that are used that are high quality literature, and that'll become important in my comments later. And by high quality, I mean they're stories, they have interesting, varied text, they have characters, they have plots, there's things to talk about in them. And in those books, as in any books, there are various kinds of things that happen that can be taken advantage of if you want to. Like in one unit, for example, and I need to give great credit to Judy Schickendance, who would be great to have here to speak some year. She's the one who was the preschool teacher for 20 years at Boston University in a lab school. And we shared the vision that the lab school experiences are good enough for university kids. They should be good enough for all children. And so the vision of the educational level that should happen came from her experiences working with children of university parents. That's sort of an aside, but to go back where I was talking. So in one book, there just happens to be a character where there's shadows that are the character casts a shadow. In another case, the shadow is sort of an important aspect of it. Well, that shadow then gets picked up and talked about in our curriculum. The story's not about shadows, so this isn't a whole unit on reading books about shadows, but it happens to be an element in the book. So in the units then, we have these storybooks, there's a certain topic, but incidental things can appear that then get taken advantage of in the curriculum. We also have expository books that are read that are thematically linked. The topics that are raised in the storybooks bring up vocabulary and concepts, which then are reinforced in the expository books, which are linked to small group activities. We have a full group time called Let's Find Out About It, which is talking. They may bring in an object, I don't think we actually use this, but it could be a sifter, like what you put flour in and you turn the crank and something goes through, and you show that to children and you talk about it and how does it work. So there would be different kinds of objects and discussions about what are things that are in the world. It's a kind of a conversation that a mother could have in her kitchen with a child who pulls something out, and you have incidental conversations about. So we have large group activities, we have small group activities, which again will build on the things that have come up in the story and core concepts. And those small group activities, as well as the large group activities, link to things that happen in centers time. So that the things that children are doing in centers time aren't just random activities, but they have some connection to a broader set of activities. And then we have center time activities. And I'm going to make this all a little more concrete in a minute, if this is going to advance here. Well, maybe I haven't turned it on. All right. Here are the units. The first two are very sort of common early childhood kinds of things. There's a certain market appeal. You've got to have things that you have to have in preschool curriculum. But the others, you notice, all have sort of a science kind of concepts. World of color, wind and water, shadows and reflection, growing things. In each case, there are topics in here that are rather more sophisticated than our standard preschools ever have. Lots of preschool curricula are pretty simplistic. So the depth of the sort of explorations are more than what you would normally expect. Now, I'm going to just illustrate this with one set of activities from the final unit, which is growing things. So one of the stories in Growing Things, and first of all, the book is usually where the curriculum starts from, so that's one of the core points of the whole series of activities. So one book is called Ugly Vegetables, and Ugly Vegetables is a book that's about a Chinese-American family who are in a suburban neighborhood surrounded with neighbors who are not Chinese-American. And the mother wants to plant vegetables that are Chinese vegetables that it turns out she's going to make into soup. And of course, all the other families have flowers and flower gardens. And so the little girl is rather dismayed at the ugly vegetables that grow in her house, and the other families have beautiful flowers. But at the end, it all works out because they get to make soup, and the soup smells wonderful, and everybody comes over and has some soup, and so there's a cultural diversity kind of theme. So out of this book, there's a whole variety of activities that flow from it. So we grow plants, make soup. This mother labels her vegetables with Chinese characters. So there's a little examination of writing systems. There's a whole theme here about diversity, and there's this pride in there's a socio-emotional theme. Now, the storybook is read in story time 4 times, and then there are these group discussions. And about one of the discussions is about, how do new plants start? And in that discussion, the teacher is suggested to bring in bulbs and seeds and talk about, well, some things grow from bulbs. I'm going to the Netherlands soon. I'm going to get to see lots of things that come from bulbs. Looking forward to that. Or seeds, and what's the difference between seeds and bulbs, okay? What parts of plants do we eat? Just sort of, again, these are discussions that could happen around everyday families, but these are planned for in this curriculum. That's kind of hard to read. Discussion of pride, of feelings. Then there are small group activities. And so the same kinds of things, looking at seeds, planting beans, making a journal, because the children are planting things. Math activity around weighing things, a small group activity, making vegetable soup. And then centers, the children plant grass, and they have a journal. They write what's happening with the grass growing. They measure how tall the grass is, and they sort and they weigh seeds, lots of different seeds, and sort them and weigh them. And they have a writing area with Chinese calligraphy. So this is, I think, sort of an answer to some of the discussions before. How do you have a variety of interconnected experiences that provide children a really rich knowledge base? And I think this is one example of how a curriculum in U.S. terms of curriculum, can give teachers a whole set of activities. And with these books, there are particular words that the teachers are recommended to teach. There are concepts that are addressed and reinforced. Now, as I go through my talk, you'll see that you still have to have teachers who understand why they're doing these things. Just having activities suggested is not sufficient. But I think that the thing that is important to recognize here is this is not a single one-dimensional kind of thing. Now we're going to study growing plants, and so all we're going to look at is leaves and stems and roots. But there's a connection of things, and some of which are kind of random. I mean, calligraphy. You wouldn't necessarily study calligraphy when you're studying growing plants, but it made sense in terms of this story. So I think in terms of developing curriculum, I think there's some advantages to thinking about curriculum planning that's interdisciplinary, especially if you have the ability to have that sort of flexibility in your planning, and can take advantage of multiple opportunities that become available because of the materials that you're working with in the interest of children, and the multiple levels in which children experience these, from a full group to small teacher-led groups down to individual work, and multiple skill areas. So we've got mathematics and literacy all tied together. Now, this is complicated, and I think one of the reasons that I am a believer in having some kind of a bound curriculum is because your average teacher or groups of teachers isn't going to come up with this set of interconnected ideas. And the comment I made earlier about planning is not only a group thing that it occurs at one point in time, but it can be cumulative over years. It reflects what I've seen happen with teachers who I've worked with in Nashville using the curriculum. The second year they do it, they know what they're going to do later on. And so there are things that come up early in the year that they know is going to connect to later in the year. And later in the year, they remember what happened earlier. And so the teachers, because they've gone through this and they know these experiences, are more able to make connections across time with the children. So again, I think having some predictability in what's being done rather than just trying to follow what seems interesting at that particular point in time is real power. I'm just curious I want to stop for a second. So I know I'm really interested in what Boston has come up with your kindergarten curriculum. Is this kind of approach something you may retained in the kindergarten curriculum, or do you have a different sort of approach?
There's a lot of similarity, but we didn't start with the books.
Mm-hmm.
We started with a thematic unit or the topic. Maybe that is the same.
It was really an interplay, yeah, because Judy really put it together, but it's kind of a back and forth.
Yeah, so we started with this idea that we wanted a science-based curriculum because
Mm-hmm.
there are such opportunities for interdisciplinary thinking
Right.
when you start with science and hands-on things that children can experience
Mm-hmm.
in the classroom. And then from there, we developed a set of what we called enduring understandings. And based then, so we had these big ideas. We want to get at these big ideas. Then what text could we use that would help children have something
Mm-hmm.
to talk about? And then from there, then we went to large group and center
Yeah.
activities.
Right. Yeah.
So this kind of
It's very.
arrows that you draw are very similar to the
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a similar conception of using multiple activity settings in the classroom day, having things interconnected, multidisciplinary. And we have 4 out of 6 of our units are science-based, and we might have done more than that if we thought we could get away with it. I mean, I think that it's really powerful to have a science base. It gives you all kinds of interesting opportunities. Okay, so that's what I wasn't planning to talk about, but I think it's a good starting point. I want to now switch over to the other things here. Let's see if I can pull this up here. All right. All right. So I'm glad that we had that discussion about curriculum, because I think that how we have high quality interactions is tied into what it is that we're talking about, as well as lots of issues around the teachers and their awareness of the children and the need for talking with children. So here's a kind of overview of things that I'm going to touch on. And some of these are probably familiar to many of you. I'm first going to talk a little bit about academic language. Then I'm going to have a fair amount of time talking about good news, which is the evidence that we have that we can make a difference, and some studies that show that. Then bad news, which we talked about some earlier, how hard it is. You particularly were objecting when someone said, "Oh, it's easier to change easier to change kids than teachers," and you thought, and then just a tad on alternative avenues that we might take, just sort of a hint of things where I'm going right now. So academic language, and this is maybe familiar to most of you. As humans, we're born to learn to use language. It's a core part of our biological sort of givens. We use it for communicating our needs and wants and our basic sort of social interactions. And the basic sort of foundational skills for language are supported sufficiently in nearly all settings, unless there's some serious kind of problems, to let children acquire language. And because it seems to happen so naturally, it's easy for cultures to develop the belief that you don't need to do anything, that children just learn language. And it's a fairly deeply rooted belief system in a number of cultures that children acquire language just naturally and you really don't have to do much about it. However, in those cultures that have more highly technological societies and some highly educated folks, like most everybody in this room, people have kind of figured out that there's specialized kinds of language that children need in order to be successful. And so it's that specialized language that just doesn't come with your biological endowment that is really critical, that makes the difference for whether or not you're going to be successful in the more demanding technological sort of uses of language that occur now in academic uses. And so literacy then draws on these ways of using language that are different from conversations. The vocabulary demands are greater. While vocabulary isn't the answer to everything, it's a part of an answer. Children need to have broad vocabulary. Grammatical structures tend to be differently used. Phrasings and the use of language is different. Things get pretty technical around this. We're going to stay pretty simple here in the early childhood world, starting with a book that is familiar to people who grew up in Boston. This is Make Way for Ducklings, which is a loved story in the United States. It's a pretty old one, but I like some old books. So here we have Mr. and Mrs. Mallard, who are looking for a place to raise their young. I'm not sure this little island is still there. Community Boathouse is here now instead of the little island. And I'm going to just show you the text. So they've been looking for a place to raise their ducklings. And here's the page of the text. Then they flew over the Charles River. This is better, quacked Mr. Mallard. And better means it's better than the places that they have talked about several pages before. And those pages before were places that had foxes and turtles and things. So the child has to know what's being talked about here. This is better, quacked Mr. Mallard. That island looks like a nice quiet place. And it's only a little way from the public garden where they'd spent the night before and had a unfortunate experience with a tricycle that nearly ran Mrs. Mallard down. Yes, said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts, what they got fed as they were paddling around the garden. That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings. So there's a lot of complicated references to other things that have happened in the story. So there's a lot of subtle connections that have to make that I just sort of alluded to as I'm trying to help those of you who don't know the book understand it. But there's also these aspects. There's vocabulary like hatch. There's this world knowledge of what they're talking about with rivers and islands. So there's vocabulary in here. Here's they're settling down to raise their ducklings on that little island, and there's the Mrs. Mallard is sitting on her nest. And the text says, then they flew over the Charles River. This is, okay, so we're still at the same place, but now I'm going to focus on a different part of it, which is the mental states. Another part of academic language is there tends to be talk about things you can't see, so people's ideas. And so here, it's only a little way from the public garden was the thing I was referencing as I was initially going through. So you have to understand why being near the public garden is important, and it's because of this verb remembering, which is a mental state verb, and what that remembering has to do with being the right place, which is that spot where the peanuts were. So there's referencing other actions, and there's talking about people's mental states and getting into the mindset of the characters in the story. I'm just going to highlight here more of the vocabulary on this page. A cozy spot. Cozy is a fairly low frequency, cozy spot, low frequency words. Settle down, a fairly low frequency phrase in English. Nests for some children, they don't necessarily know what nests are. Molting is a pretty complicated term that refers to when the feathers fall out. And interestingly, the children are given a little lesson in the fact that language sometimes is self-defining. So to molt, and then the next whole sentence defines what to molt means. So there's a complicated kind of textual thing going on here. So children are not only learning the meanings of molt, but they're learning that language, if you listen, sometimes language will define something. So there's a whole lot of complicated vocabulary, language, and grammar that's happening here. Oh, and then there's complex sentences here. I'm not going to read these to you, but you see these sentences that are underlined, how long and complex they are, which is certainly not what you're going to run into in a preschool classroom in most conversations. So we have one story then, just a page out of a book. That's exemplifying some of the features of academic language. Which are rather somewhat different than if you're in a high school where you're looking at science texts and things. So what I wanted to talk about now a little bit is how the relationship between children's exposure to an acquisition of this early language and their later reading. So how do we get from reading Make Way for Ducklings to being a good reader? And what I have here is a little model that is very well known in the reading world, which is the theory called the simple view of reading. In the simple view of reading, reading comprehension is the byproduct of being able to decode and having the language skills to make sense of what you've decoded. Catherine sort of alluded to that earlier, as you have to get to a certain level of decoding, but then it's the language that's really important. Now, that's a very widely accepted view of reading comprehension. But what I want to do is back things up that hasn't been done so much. To just mention, to tell you that there's quite a body of research now that relates language development in the birth to kindergarten year to later language. So Catherine said it in a more brief way. She said, you know, where you start is where you end up. I mean, there's enormous amounts of research now that indicates that the language abilities of children when they're 18 months, 2, 3 years old are very highly related to their language later. The part of this story that hasn't been recognized as fully yet is the other part here. There is evidence from a scattering of studies as well as a study that I've done recently that hopefully will find its way into print soon, that language in these early preschool years is very connected to and may well be helping to drive some of these print skills that we tend to beat on, phonological awareness and even letter knowledge. So that children who are making progress with early language are also, those language abilities are benefiting the print skills that are helping with this decoding. So we have a dual set of influences from early language. The top line has been known for a long time. This is less well recognized. And these data come from English, from Dutch. I don't know if there's any Spanish. So there's a fairly good body of evidence now that supports this. And I think this is important to realize when you're in situations where there's a lot of pressure on decoding kinds of things, phonological awareness and letter knowledge. And sometimes, unfortunately, that comes at the expense of attending to language. And I think when we do that, not only are we undermining what's most important, which is language, but we may also be short-circuiting some of the print support for print development that we have. So when I'm thinking about what do we want to do to support literacy, there's a couple quotes that I like that I think sort of help frame the way I think we need to think about what's needed. And this was one from David Corson. Oral participation in a culture of literacy seems at least as important for vocabulary acquisition as some of the work on which schools cannot concentrate in the formal teaching of reading or direct instruction. So if we want to get to the end of being literate, or I would even expand, he talks about vocabulary, use of academic language. We're not going to get children competent in understanding and producing academic language if they don't have opportunities to experience it and use it. I mean, Catherine didn't talk today about her work with middle school students and these efforts that are trying to get children engaged in debating and using ideas. And we think we have to create environments where children are talking and using language. So we're not going to have children become literate if they're not able to begin participating in literate cultures, and that includes conversations with teachers. Okay. So how do we do that? So there's evidence now that we can get teachers, that we have some ability to foster teacher-child interaction, and that can result in improved language development. And so the first effort that I had along that line was the work with Catherine, the homeschool study, where we were back in the era when Betty Hart and Todd Risley were looking at these huge class differences. Catherine had already done a study interested in trying to look at what are the factors that support learning, and we started to look at children from low-income backgrounds. We're interested in looking at the variability within children who all came from low-income backgrounds, rather than trying to say, well, what happens if you have a university degree as opposed to like high school education? So we looked at children from age 3 to grades through 7 and 8. And look carefully at the experiences of the children in the homes and their classrooms. And in particular, I, or my graduate students, transcribed lots of interactions, coded those interactions, and then we tested children in kindergarten and first grade. We had information on the parents, their backgrounds, and so forth. And so after a long time, we were able to put together a picture of what made a difference for children's reading comprehension, and we were able to test children in 4th grade. And we had tests from when children were in kindergarten, and of course their print knowledge, letter knowledge, phonological awareness, spelling. Those were predictive of reading comprehension. But of course there's another piece here. The receptive vocabulary was even more predictive of reading comprehension. And so that's just testing. I mean, a lot of people, that's been done many, many times. What hasn't been done so many times is the more painful part of transcribing teacher-child conversations and finding the extent to which those conversations were related to children's later development. And when we did that with these teachers, we found that the percentage of vocabulary that they used that was sophisticated, lower frequency vocabulary, was predictive of of children's so this is when they were 4. The teachers were using language in free play. And the free play use and vocabulary was correlated with their print knowledge in kindergarten. That was a surprise, but also, as we had hoped, with receptive vocabulary. The talk during book reading, analytical talk, meanings of words, what characters, why does Mrs. Mallard, want to go to that island and not somewhere else? That was also quite predictive of receptive vocabulary. And these abilities here then were related to 4th grade reading comprehension. So we have at least correlational evidence that the specific kinds of talk that happens in preschools are related to children's later performance. And these kinds of things now we've been talking about this for a long time. So I think a lot of this is out in the literature. I don't think any of this is like particularly surprisingly new to people. But some of these things here, so use of lower frequency vocabulary, analytic talk about books. What I have here is what are the kinds of challenges that teachers face in doing this? So in order to use lower frequency vocabulary, what does a teacher need to be able to do? Well, she has to have a vocabulary herself and associated knowledge. She has to be inclined to talk to children about things. Analytic talk about books. You have to be comfortable reading books. In studies that we've had, we had teachers stumbling over the reading of the preschool books that we had given them. They have to be comfortable talking about words and word meanings. Teachers have to talk less and listen more. They have to see that it's worth talking to children and that they should do it. And they should listen. My colleague Dale Farron has done work collecting data in Head Start and in pre-K classrooms across Tennessee, recording moment to moment what's happening. The percentage of time that the teachers talk as opposed to the children talk. Okay, how many think the teachers talk? Here, I'm going to give you 3 options here. This is like in the baseball park. How many people do we think are in Fenway Park today? They get clause for different numbers. So I'm going to give you 60%, 70%, or 90%. So 60, 75, or 90. How many think 60% of the time teachers talk? 75%. 90. Oh, you're all. Oh, it's not that bad. But around 75 to 80% of the time is how much time the teachers are talking, and which means the children are not talking. So I'm talking a whole lot, and I want to stop talking for just a second. I'm curious, of these various challenges, which of these do you see as things that you resonate to or that are particularly problematic in your situations? Yeah, Mariella, are you just? I got you anyway. Your hand was up.
I think that probably just the idea that teachers need to talk less, because in our teacher training programs, we are developing the role of professionals to be the most important role in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe we're training teachers to facilitate child-child interactions in a learning context. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In fact, I'm thinking about my early childhood graduate course, and I dedicate 20% of the time, maybe 10% of the time, to talking about child-child interactions. I'm always so focused in developing them as professionals. Mm-hmm, so I think that's a challenge, that idea.
Yeah, right. Yes?
Listening to you, I think that our biggest issue is that we have very big class size. So we don't have that kind of opportunity of one-to-one conversation. And when children start asking questions, then the teacher is like, "Come to your seat," Like, I have other 40 children going around. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and that not time to answer questions, I think, is an important point. When Catherine was showing those data, I love that study. I actually also wondered why it hasn't gotten more press. It seems like it should be one of those things that everybody cites, but they don't. the number of questions that she reported in middle class homes is striking. What's also striking, if you look at how many questions do you hear that are curiosity questions in preschool classrooms, it's almost never. The idea is that 4-year-old children and 5-year-old children, they're always asking questions. They don't typically ask questions in classrooms, and it's partly as a class size, but partly I think there are social messages about who should ask. I think partly it's having activities in which children are encouraged to ask questions. I mean, to me, that's a really interesting indicator of quality, is our kids asking questions about things they're interested in rather than, can I go to the bathroom? I mean, that's usually. So, yes?
Well, I love the way you put the seeing children as conversational partners. That's inherently a democratic idea, to share power with children. I mean, that's what you're describing.
Yeah.
That's not always where we go. I know certainly in the U.S. and talking with some colleagues during the small group conversations, having that same conversation in other places too.
Well, and to see children as having minds that are, thoughts that are interesting that you can engage them in. I mean, I think that teachers don't necessarily recognize that, or they don't have the opportunities to experience it. Yeah.
And I'm looking at this requires list and aligning that with the various teacher qualification requirements, and seeing that in some contexts, particularly for through age 5, the teacher qualification requirements are not going to match up with that. And how do we look at the teacher qualification requirements and saying, well, you need to take a hand washing class and get a certificate for sitting a lecture. You cannot expect that individual to have those competencies. There's a disconnect between the teacher competencies and those requirements.
Yeah, and of course the reality, unfortunately, in the United States and I think a lot of other countries is we don't pay enough to get people. Not necessarily true in Boston. I think there's some professors who might want to go teach in Boston if it's for the salary. But when I was working with the project I'll talk about, I think, in Alabama, we had teachers who were deciding, well, maybe I'd be better off going to Walmart because they could make more money. And so you have turnover. Because the salaries are so low. The people who had BA certification or maybe a master's degree who were our coaches, they were really high turnover because they could do other kinds of things. And so how we match up the desire to have people who are literate and able to talk about language and so forth with the salary scale that tells them that they're not very important, that's a real challenge. And I think that's one of the things then that leads me back to why we need to have curriculum that are fairly structured. Boston Public Schools, you are fortunate to have well-educated teachers, but that's not generic, and that's not universally, certainly not in these some of these countries in Chile and these other countries that you're dealing with. Really challenging. Okay, so there are a lot of qualities of teachers that we want that are important to engaging in useful kinds of conversation that don't necessarily come easily. I mean, we did broad knowledge, broad vocabulary and associated knowledge. That's something we were talking about this morning. That's a challenging one. So here's my success story. It's a far smaller scale than Boston Public School, but it's something we have a little something that BPS doesn't have. Which is some hints about why it worked. So this was a grant that was something that Washington did right. It actually did right in the second Bush era. The only thing I can think of. They funded classrooms for a period of time to create high quality preschool classrooms. And we worked with classrooms between 11 and 13 classrooms. They were with Nashville Public Schools, and these were BA certified teachers. We used the OWL curriculum and had coaches in the classrooms. These are all really important features. There was professional development. This was Deborah Rowe, my colleague at Vanderbilt, who's an expert in early writing development, and I worked on it. And I think an important feature also is that data were collected in their classrooms in the fall and the spring by external data collectors, and those data were fed back to the teachers. And so I'll show you some of those data. But the teachers got information on their performance on measures that were indicators of quality, also on their children's growth. And so when we started this study, the teachers were a little nervous about all this data collection. After the second or third year, they were waiting to have the data. They really cared about it. And that's something I think is really important if there's any way to figure out how to do that. So, okay, we had a fair number, about a quarter of the children were, about 15% were Hispanic, many of those second language, and we had a number of second language learners. Nashville has a lot of different groups: Kurdish, Somalian, Egyptian, Vietnamese, fair number of African Americans. So, all right, I think I've talked about all this. Yeah, I've talked about all that. So here are the data. We use something called a regression discontinuity analysis, where you compare groups who have been through the preschool experience with children who didn't get in, and you look at their birth dates and compare the relative performance of those who had the experience with those who didn't. And we were able to do this kind of an analysis across three waves of data. So it was sort of a multiple replication study of the effects of this. And we had a number of different measures. So were they learning letters, spelling? These are Woodcock-Johnson, for those of you who know that. PPVT, receptive vocabulary, expressive vocabulary, and oral comprehension. Now, the easiest group to get effects on were the English language learners, because they didn't know any English. But not everybody gets that. But we did have, so we had significant effects on their letter knowledge, on their spelling, receptive vocabulary. We did not have any effects on their oral comprehension. And I think it's harder to get children to the point where they know enough English to hold ideas together, to develop comprehension. Interestingly, the native English results, it's not too hard to teach kids some letters that they don't know. It took a while before we got to vocabulary. It was only in the final year, after we got really good classrooms, and I'm going to show you one in a minute, where we got effects on receptive vocabulary, and we actually got effects on oral comprehension. So I'm showing you these data to let you know we actually have evidence that we made a difference for these children, and especially the English language learners. This is kind of what it looked like. So here we can see the PPVT, and these lines down here are the Hispanic, which would have been Spanish speakers, and there were other minority backgrounds from these other language groups. Now, while we had those nice stars and significant effects, you can see we're still pretty far below where the native speakers are. We had the native speakers are showing growth here. And then this is down the PPVT. You can see we get the kids up to 75, which is still well below national norms. We're getting great growth. And we break them out this is broken by ELL status. Down here we have, this is year 3 data. We see this, basically we're replicating year 2 data and year 3 data. So the point is, we're getting good growth in all of the children, but we're certainly still, the kids who are coming in as most of them come in with varying degrees of English, some not speaking at all, others having some growth. We're moving them, but they certainly are not fluent. We're not ready to throw them into the mainstream, like here in Massachusetts or other places where they say, okay, enough children, enough of that sort of Spanish stuff. Now you've learned English. So, what was it that actually made a difference? This is where I think we can add something that's interesting. We looked at the fidelity of implementation of the OWL curriculum across the different curricular times of the day. So in that little beginning time, I sort of gave you a little introduction to the fact that there are specific times during the day. So there's a morning meeting time, there's writing, and it's supposed to be writing in centers, there's story time. And these different little colors here show the fidelity of implementation. So in year 1, there's not too much that's colored. If it's colored, it means we had reasonable fidelity. The red is really good fidelity. By year 2, we had really good fidelity, and we maintained it in year 3. So this is to say, we had pretty good fidelity to the curriculum by the second year. We also use something called the ELCO. It's a tool for describing the classrooms along a number of different dimensions: a language environment, teacher-child conversations, book reading, early print. And we looked at children's, the performance of the classrooms on the ELCO. Again, we have the yellow, that's year one. We look across the years. So as you move left to right, we move toward the third year. We visited twice a year. And these are the different areas. Probably the most important one is the language and literacy as a subscale, a number of items put together. And you can see we had an upward march here to really actually quite good fidelity. This is the average fidelity in most classrooms that are reasonably good is the 3.5. You can see, if people say, here's our showcase classroom, this is a good classroom. We were in a 3.5 classroom the other day, those of you who were with me. And then we were in another classroom that was way up here, the second classroom that we went to. So we had good fidelity, and we managed to get there across those years when we had the outcomes. This is what the fidelity is. I'm showing you this fidelity checklist because I'm going to come back to talking about fidelity measures. So this is what it looked like. Teacher reads and discusses the book in a manner consistent with the curriculum. So that there's guidance for how you're supposed to read the book. Teacher defines and or uses sophisticated vocabulary in ways that teach meanings. And there's different, and you're supposed to vary it, but whether it's reads 1 or 2 or reads 3 and 4. So they get credit for whether they're actually defining words. Are they responding to children's questions? Are they having thoughtful discussions after the story has been read? So when we say they're doing things with fidelity, it means they're, yeah.
Sorry, people need you to slow down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I want to catch it. This
Yeah.
is very interesting.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm watching the clock here. So, we have different features of the reading. Oops. How do we go back up? No, what did I do now? I turned it all off. That'll slow me down. Where am I in this whole show? Way at the beginning?
No, you should be right there.
Well, it's going to, in a minute, we're going to get to see a teacher. You don't have to listen to me. All right. Okay. So, the point is, the teachers had this, they knew what was on this form. The researchers used this form to look at things about their reading. So defining words, reading the words with expression, responding to children, understanding characters' feelings and motivations. So we made very explicit what a good reading discussion should include. And when I showed you those bars of high fidelity, this is what I was showing you. The teachers were doing this kind of thing with consistency. And this is the data the teachers got from the visitors. The visitors came in and said, yeah, this is what I saw, or I didn't see. So now I'm going to take you to a classroom of a teacher, and we'll see how it works for translation. I'll try to, she talks pretty slowly. This is Kelly Bolton, slower than me. Absolutely wonderful teacher of children who are all second language learners. I don't have the data here. About evenly divided between Spanish speakers and children from Arabic speaking homes. And the children, most of them came in speaking very little English. Because this was a study where we went and tested all of our children, we just happened to know that the children in her classroom, on average, the first year made, when we were just getting going, this is in standard score, PPVT, they made 10-point gains. Years 2 and 3, they made more than a standard deviation growth on average in her classroom. Expressive vocabulary, on average, growth of a standard deviation in a third or a half. So on objective terms, these children were learning a heck of a lot. They were learning letters too. So what did Kelly look like? Oh, here I have this. So here we have 20 children. Okay. All but 2 entered speaking not much English. Okay, 8 Arabic, 12 from Spanish-speaking home. So I'm going to show you Kelly interacting with her children during book reading. And okay, where's the video here? What we have is a reading from when she read the book the first time and when she read it on day 3. And let me see, I want to be able to pause this so I can talk too.
In the spring, I help.
Okay, so we have ugly vegetables here. Just so happens I planned this incredibly well. So the way we recommend teachers read the books is the first time through is they tell children things. They define words. They introduce concepts. They don't do lots of stopping and asking the children what they think words mean when they haven't taught the children the words. They don't stop and have lots of discussions about the story. As they move along in the readings, there are more opportunities to bring children into producing the text. So what we're going to see here is Kelly on her first day reading the book Ugly Vegetables. And can I explain this a little bit? Yeah, okay, there we go. All right.
In the spring, I helped my mother start our garden.
Is it loud enough?
And that's where you plant the seeds, where you can have flowers or vegetables. We use tall shovels. This is the tall shovel that you use to dig a hole. To turn the grass upside down. That means they take the grass and they turn it, dulce, upside down. So that the grass is kind of on the bottom now so that you can get to the dirt. And I saw pink worms. Those are earthworms. We'll have some in our room that we'll look at later on. That wriggle around. It was hard work. And when we stopped to rest, we saw that the neighbors were starting their gardens too. Hello, Irma, my mother called to Miss Krummerine. Mrs. Krummerine was digging too. She was using a small shovel. So she had a small one that fit in her hand. Mommy, I asked, why are you using such a big shovel? Remember, that's what we used to dig the holes. Miss Krummerine has a small one because our garden needs more digging, she said. So they're going to have to dig more holes. So that's why they need the big shovel.
So just note yeah. Yeah, no, she's turning away. I know that there's a problem with the way she got mic'd. So she's got specific words, and actually some of these words that she's focusing on, like shovel, she also has picture cards that come with the curriculum of a shovel. And so the children are having times talking about shovels and reviewing the words of shovels. You notice how much gesturing she does. And the repetition, and the thing I want to call out that you probably noticed, but she's also always filling in information, why they're doing things. So there's this explanatory talk about what things are happening.
Helped my mother plant the seeds. Remember, the seeds, boys and girls, were what we talked about this morning that you put in the ground. And we dragged the hose to the garden. This is the water hose, just like we talked about in Minerva Louise. Remember how we talked about the garden hose? She wanted to use it as a scarf, you're right. Well, in this story, they're using it to spray the water. Hi, Linda. Hi, Mickey. I called to the...
So she was making reference to another book. There's a Minerva Louise, this chicken that goes out and does funny things with herself. So there's connections across time here.
One day, my mother and I picked the vegetables from the garden. We filled a whole wheelbarrow full of them. The wheelbarrow, boys and girls, listen, Benny, has one wheel and you hold on to it, and you hold it up, and then you can push it. And so that's what they're using to take the vegetables from the garden.
So I'm going to move here to
house.
day 3 here, just about.
We filled a whole wheelbarrow full of them, and we wheeled them to the kitchen, and my mother washed them, and then she took a big knife and started to chop them. So they washed them up, and now she's starting to chop them with her big knife. There's her big knife right there. Yow, she said when she cut them. She had to use all of her muscles. The vegetables were hard and tough.
Okay, so now here we go.
In the spring, I helped my mother start what are they starting? A garden. And they used what? What did we call this? Shovels. To turn the grass upside down. And I saw, what did she find in the soil?
The little guy down here just acted it out, too.
Worms, pink worms. And they would wriggle around. It was hard work. And when we stopped to rest, the neighbors were planting their what? Flowers, their flower gardens. Hello, Irma, my mother called to Miss Crewmarine. Miss Crewmarine was digging too, and she was using a small, what? Shovel. Remember, she had a small one that fit in her hand. And so the little girl asked a question. She says, Mommy, why are we using such big shovels?
Because they're garden
Because they had to do more.
garden.
What, Christian?
Digging.
Digging.
Because they're garden big.
Well, they were planting some different things in their gardens. So I helped my mother plant what did they put in the ground? The seeds. And we dragged what is that called, Sarah? The water hose. Those seeds. I think her garden was nice. She is sad.
Okay, I want to get to the end here. Is that?
One day, her and her mother picked the vegetables. And then what did they do with the vegetables? Well, before they washed it, though, they put them in the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow. And then they took them inside and they did what? Washed them and cut them. Like that. You can do that with me. That's what she did.
All right, so there. I had to get to the hi-ya part. Yeah. Okay. So there we see Kelly having a whole language lesson about those particular words, and the kids I didn't draw your attention to it, but it was pretty obvious they were engaged that first time, even though they weren't talking, they were listening, and they were making a lot of able later on to participate and fill in lots of those words. When do you want me to be done here? I'm a little before 4? Oh, okay, all right. So I want to show you her use of another book that's part of this unit, an expository book. And you can see again how she's connecting things and why it's possible and what it takes for children to start to have the sort of gains that she was showing in her classroom. And I spent a couple of days in there doing the videotaping, and I'm afraid I might have mic'd the teacher badly too. But I can't tell you how many times during the day I heard her using the word vegetable. And here's during a separate time of the day when they're reading another book that's connected to it. And this is a book that she read 1 or 2 times, I think.
And giving them water. You have to give them water. That's what helps them to grow. And they put a little stick so that they remember what they planted. So each of the little sticks, this says tomato, potato, green bean, carrot. That way they know what they planted there. And waiting for the warm sun to make them grow. So they have to have the sun and they have to have water to help them to grow. And look, they're beginning to grow. You're beginning to see them come up. They're getting bigger. And grow. They're getting even bigger.
Okay, so you get the idea. She goes through, she makes
And they grow into
Whoops.
plants.
I guess it's still going.
So
here.
there's the pea, and some of them, the squash blossom, get flowers. Some of them grow a flower.
That'll stop it.
Pumpkins do have a flower, you're right.
I'll stop it there. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. So we see, again, lots of explanation. The children are hearing a lot from her. Now, these are group situations where there's a lot of the teacher talk. I'm going to just do a brief bit of this. I mentioned earlier that we have group times when things are demonstrated and talked about, and this is what she did on the days that I was there around vegetables.
We're probably not going to pet or touch all of the vegetables today. You're going to help Miss Bolton make the vegetable soup, so you will get to touch the vegetables then, okay? All right? Well, boys and girls, we also, since we talked about how they grow on the farms, we know that the vegetables begin as tiny seeds. So you plant the seeds in the ground. So with the vegetables we're going to look at, you plant the seeds in the ground and then they start to grow. So the seeds make the vegetables. So
these are concept cards that she's using here that she then puts in the writing area, and that the children those would be available when they're writing, and they're illustrations of the relationships between the objects and the process, and describe the processes that's going on.
that's where we get the vegetables. You're right, Merle. The seeds go under the ground. Do you remember when we talked about the pumpkin and we cut the pumpkin open?
And just notice she's very responsive to the children, even though it's a group situation. So I'm going to stop that. But you get the sense she has her little cooler healers filled with these things that she's pulling out at different times during the day. And I'm just going to give you another taste during math time. She digs into her cooler, and this is a small. It's actually this. In the owl day, it's whoops, that's the wrong one. Structured as the small group time. Oh, did I lose it? Oh, I don't know. I guess I don't. Maybe I've shut it down by accident. Anyway, no, I don't want that one. Too many different things here on this drive. Here we go. I've got it. So during her math time, there's a scale, and she again pulls out the carrots. They all love the carrots and the celery. They name what they are, and they weigh these things in a little small group. And there are only like 4 children. I seem to have shut that down, but there you see the children talking more. You can also see, I saw her sitting with 2 children in the dramatic play area, cutting up vegetables and making vegetable soup. So this is recurrent exposure to the objects, the language, and opportunities for children to talk. First they hear, and then opportunities to talk about things. All right, it's not working anymore. So is that the down arrow? Return? What's? Yeah, I've done something here, so it's not advancing. It's good. There's a timer here. What's going on here? So, I'm curious. Are these sort of informational books, expository books? Is that something that you're seeing used? In other words, I'm sure that Boston schools use that. Is that something that's present and used in the Netherlands? Do they use the? Yeah. And how do teachers respond to using them? Are they comfortable with them?
They use them, but it's less common to use.
Uh-huh.
And they are not always aware of the fact that you can use a part of that book. And that you can use it differently from using stories.
Right.
In terms of getting children
Right.
So it's really a different kind of thing.
Right.
It's less common, but it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this book, and there are books that are sort of hybrid books. I mean, this one that I'm showing you is kind of a story-like book that's also got information in it. But it's good to have ones. Sometimes they have diagrams, and so you don't have to read the whole story. I mean, I think that's an important thing that teachers don't necessarily recognize. Okay, so I guess this was the next. All right, where I was going to go next. So what I had promised you was that I was going to help you understand, to the extent that we know, some of the features of that intervention, the early reading first intervention, that made a difference for children's learning. So I showed you a teacher, and I think that maybe is the most powerful evidence. Not all the teachers were as clear and on target as she. I mean, we would have had incredible results, but she's an example of what we were trying to accomplish. I showed you the data for looking at our classrooms through the lens of the ELCO, the environmental tool, and the curriculum fidelity tool. We also had something that Dale Farron, who's at Vanderbilt, has created, a very interesting tool called the narrative record, which she now has made so that it runs on an iPad that has a time counter in it, and the observers are able to go in and record in great detail the things that are happening in the classroom in terms of the structure, what's happening in terms of the organization of the classroom, in terms of children's engagement, and the level of teachers' intellectual challenges for children. And so we had that data on our classrooms, and the teachers found it very interesting. These are from earlier in the study, and the thing that was particularly shocking to them initially was how much time they spent in transitions. This is actually less than it was the previous year. And if you look in a lot of classrooms on a moment-to-moment basis, you'll find enormous amounts of time are spent in transitions. This thing called OWL transitions, those were times when we actually used the transitional period for names and colors and sort of, if you're wearing stripes today, you can get up and get in line, and that kind of thing. If your name begins with, get in line, that would be an OWL transition. So the teachers got this kind of information. She said about 9%, 13% of their time was in centers. So we had that kind of a data. And we had data, the percentage of the day when they were actually on task using the curriculum that they were asked to do, the OWL curriculum. So you see that the green bars here got up to like 30% of the day. So there's all kinds of other things that happen in classrooms. So you have to just be aware that there are lots of things going on in classrooms. And even if you really have classrooms that are doing what you want, it's only going to be for a portion of the day. Here's where the time was spent, and by the level of classroom involvement. So this is interesting. You'll see why it's important in a minute. This is how engaged the children were in the activities, and on her scale, a 2 is the children are just sort of basically interested. A 3 is they're really involved. We were seeing in Kelly's room, those children were between a 3 and a 4 in terms of their level of engagement. So we had the small groups is where the children tended to be the most engaged. Not very often did people do seat work, but that was some. Centers, they were highly engaged. So we had the children were engaged in general, even in the whole groups. By the end of the year, by the end of the project, they were really quite involved in the group times. So what I want to do now is look at data. We have these fidelity data, and we have children's outcome data. So we looked at fidelity. Were they doing the curriculum in these different times of the day? How well were they doing book reading? Were they doing it the way they were supposed to? Were they doing small groups the way they were supposed to? We also looked at something I called construct level fidelity. So during an activity, they were supposed to be teaching language. Were they dealing with language? And so language could happen in many times during the day. Phonological awareness wasn't just one time of the day. There was a time of the day that was specific to it, but it could happen at other times of the day. So we could look at the times that might be supporting the phonological awareness or the letter knowledge. And here's the data. When we look at the growth in language skills, print skills, and phonological awareness, we can cross it with our scores on these different ways of looking at the classrooms. So one way to look at the classroom was in terms of this general tool called the ELCO. And we found that this overall scores on the ELCO were related to children's language growth. It was predictive of language and phonological awareness. So, the interesting thing, since language is what we're most interested in, or I'm most interested in here, you'll see there's not very many places filled in under language. That means there were not many times during the day when higher fidelity related to language. One of was this sort of across the day, pretty good teachers. And then one time during the use of the OWL curriculum was story time. And that's the time that we were trying to focus on vocabulary, and doing that well was related to their language growth. Interestingly, the other piece, this is the new news. That's probably would be what you'd predict. That's what we wanted. But the interesting thing from this narrative record, where we recorded by the moment, is the amount of time during the day when there was actually teaching going on. So across the day, the ELCO is sort of an across the day measure. Across the day, the teacher was actually on it, and the child involvement. And I think that's and the small group child involvement, 2 child involvement scales. When people go and do evaluations of curriculum, usually they look to how well the teacher is doing it. Is the teacher doing what the teacher's supposed to do? And this tool gave us a way to look at, are the kids actually with it? And so it's okay if the teacher's doing the things, but are the children receptive? And so for language growth, you see 3 of these things that were predictive had to do with the kids' engagement. And it was the book reading and then sort of general quality across the day. Lots of things were predictive of children's growth in print. I'm not going to bother to go through them, and phonological awareness. I think there's lots of times during the day when we can be fostering those. But I think that the language book is important, book time is important, but kids being involved and teachers doing activities that are drawing the children in and holding their interest are really important. And I pretty much said that, so I don't need to look at that. All right, I am going to sort of skip forward, but there's one important message that I want to get across here. There have been efforts to try to change language in classrooms, the whole classroom day, and a number of them have not been successful, including one I did. It's not easy. As Catherine was showing you data earlier and mentioning, it's not easy to change language through a whole classroom kind of effort. And I'm going to skip this. There's huge variability from one teacher to the next. This is looking at average content taught by different settings. And what we see here is that what I'll focus on here is talk about vocabulary, this blue line. We can see in these classrooms there was during book reading, an average teachers talked about words and three words of reading, but there was a variation from almost 9 until 0. In the group discussion times between 0 and 10. So there's a lot of teacher-to-teacher variability. And that's one of the big challenges for getting consistent growth across classrooms, is how do you get things to work with any consistency. I'm going to skip this. If anybody, this is a paper that came out in Early Childhood Research Quarterly about the fact that classroom setting is really what predicts language variability. And I'm sorry for going fast, but I want to there's something that's new here that you haven't seen before. This is an interesting analysis that was done by one of my doc students who was formerly at Harvard, if she looks vaguely familiar, Jin-Sil Mok. She looked at the lessons that were taught by different teachers using the OWL curriculum in a Head Start program. There's a lesson around making lemonade. And the making lemonade has interesting possibilities for instruction, but of course there's a fun element to it of making lemonade. And what I'm going to pull out are two teachers that she looked at who both managed to get the children to make lemonade, but did it in very different ways. And so in the curriculum, there's a number of words that the teacher is encouraged to use. So here are the instructional purposes: observe, explore, describe plants, and so forth. And vocabulary, words like seeds and sweet and measure and mix. There are, I don't know, about 10, 12 words that teachers are encouraged to use. So when Jinsil looked at these teachers, there's a teacher I'm going to call the conceptual teacher and a procedural teacher. The conceptual teacher, all these yellow spots were recommended words. She used lots of the recommended words. This teacher used seeds, lemon, sour, stirred, and lemonade. So she used 1, 2, 3, 6 words. And these empty circles are words that were associated with them. So you can just see that this teacher was a much more varied mixture of words. And the reason I call this a procedural teacher is, if I had time, you could see the videotape. She was all about making lemonade and not getting the lemon juice in your eye because it's going to burn. This is a good Head Start teacher. Safety, health and safety is the #1 thing, okay? And she was careful not to swallow seeds, and these little knives that are going to cut, don't cut yourself with the knives. So this teacher was very focused, and all the kids got to drink lemonade. Both teachers, from some perspective, both teachers had successful lemonade lessons. They made lemonade, and the kids drank the lemonade, and they talked about it was sweet and so forth. However, this teacher taught. And so this is the vocabulary that she used. And when Jinsil looked at the conceptual interconnections, this is the conceptual. Let's see, did I skip over one here? Yeah, okay. Here's the conceptually rich teacher. So she has connections between lemons, makes your mouth look different, and that you can squeeze them. Let's see. Wait a minute. Do I have this backwards? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's the procedural teacher. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the procedural teacher. She's about sort of very impoverished relationships between lemon and the other concepts here. And you'll just see that there's not very many concepts that are interconnected here. And the purple are process things, so most of it is about the process of making lemonade, because that's what the focus was. Classification is absent. There's no classification of lemons. We look at the next teacher here, we see that she does have purple process words, but she also has properties of lemons, and she does some classification. They're fruit, they're orange, the lemons, and there's different kinds of fruit. There's oranges and apples, and they have a course. So the teacher who got it, who understood that this was a lesson about fruits and related to broader issues, created much more rich learning opportunities for children. So the surface features were the same, but the actual overall learning was quite different. And I think that's one of the challenges in having high fidelity instruction. It's okay, you go through, a principal could walk through, a director could walk through, oh good, you're doing the curriculum, you're doing the lemonade lesson, that's great. But is it all about, getting the lemons and, is it making lemonade, or learning about lemons and going beyond the basic sort of stuff? I'm going to cut to the end here. What I'm working on right now is an intervention in which we're trying to get teachers to do book reading in a way that's reasonably high quality with some consistency. It's a project I'm doing with Roberta Golenkopf and Kathy Hirsch-Pasek. We give teachers guidance. I'm a big believer in some guidance for what to do. We have picture cards that give them the vocabulary. Define the words to be defined, questions to ask, and some coaching. Here's the form. You see this fidelity, like the fidelity form I showed you earlier, the same kind of idea. The teachers have these to use, the researchers, the coaches use these with the teachers. And we're getting good effects. on receptive vocabulary and depth of knowledge around us one effect size of 1. So I'm encouraged, and we actually got some effects on standardized measures of PPVT and measures of self-regulation. So this is just targeting book reading, not trying to change everything in the classroom day, but going after the one time of the day that evidence over and over again says matters, and evidence also says it's not done very well in many cases. Teachers aren't defining words. Teachers aren't engaging children in conversations. So I'm trying to create something that will could be used with many curricula that would be able to provide a richness for children. So, thank you. Sure. I mean, I have time. So, I didn't give you much time to talk. Yes.
You showed those cards at the end.
Right.
As a kind of tool for teachers.
Right.
If you provide those to the teachers, doesn't that lead to more procedural teachers? Fill in the definitions of the words and stuff. So I wonder whether if you keep that box is empty, definition, so this is a word, and you think of the definition yourself.
But they won't.
Well,
They might see. That's an empirical question. I mean, I know that at the end of this project, we asked the teachers what they think they would continue to use in the methods if they liked it, and they did like it, and they said what would be helpful, and they said they would like to have the guidance. What I would like to know, my worry, I mean, I would rather the teachers would get the idea and would begin to do it. I know that on the spot defining words is not easy, and that in an ideal world we would get teachers to the point where they had support like that for 5, 6, 8 books, and they could begin to do it on their own. That would be where I would like to go. I've gotten to the point of saying, being a little cynical or realistic, or I don't know what the right word is, and also realistic, because in a lot of the programs in the United States, you may have, especially with low-income children or multilingual children, the teacher's first language isn't English, and they'll be running into words that they may not know, and that's one of the reasons. But yeah, there's the tension around scripting and not scripting. I'm kind of going toward what I call light scripting. Yeah.
David, I was going to ask you, what is, it struck me a little bit your idea of fidelity, because to me fidelity has to do with how we implement as researchers or teacher training.
Mm-hmm.
We implement the program, because that's another level of fidelity.
Mm-hmm.
People are like how often your coaches go into the classroom, or how many books you end up modeling, things like this. And now, when you're using fidelity here, to me that's like more teacher performance, like what the teacher has learned.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to clarify, do you check the fidelity, the every time fidelity, like how many times your coaches go in, or how many books you model, or things like that?
Yeah, in this project, the coaches were working closely with us, and so we were getting reports from them, so we knew how regularly they were going. We probably could have had a closer way of determining the nature of their interactions with teachers. In more of a program setting, I think you do have to have where it's not such a sort of little hothouse kind of research project. I think you do need to have ways of tracking the coach's fidelity for sure. We were finding out about the teachers' use of the books because the coaches were in there every week or two. But I think that I'm doing a project in Abu Dhabi right now, which I spared you from hearing all about. But the key to that has been, we have coaches there also. The same thing, you may call it teacher performance. I call it making objectively describable what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And yeah, you know, if you're not doing this, you're not performing, but you're also, there's low fidelity to what we're doing. So if I see it as making a visible statement of what classrooms should look like, what book reading should look like here. And if you're not doing it, you're not doing it. Then there becomes the issue of how does that information feed into evaluation decisions and oversight. I mean, that's another set of issues. You know, in the coaching, we try to keep within the coaching world, so it's not directly affecting the teacher's evaluation from the principal. Yeah, Mario?
Was there something particularly important for ELL students? You showed us some data for ELL students, and I'm wondering, you know, in some ways, they have more to grow, right? So they start lower than the native English speakers, and so there's a lot of growth. But still, after the first year, they're still below the English language speakers. So can you comment on that? And then was there something particularly salient of the book reading or the narrative record that you thought was critical for those students?
Okay, there's 2 or 3 things here. Comment on one, they showed a lot of growth and they were still behind. That's right, and I would answer to that, you can't do it in 1 year. You know, 1 1/3 standard deviation growth in a year, I'm happy with that. But then we got to have kindergarten teachers that continue it and first grade teachers, and by and large we don't. So now in terms of, we didn't have a large enough sample to be able to see if particular things related to the growth of ELLs. I mean, I'm lucky, I don't know of any intervention studies that actually can point to processes that are linked to outcomes. So I'm happy to have that. I look at Kelly and I say, okay, she does so much repetitive things, so consistent. She uses the same phrases, the same gestures. I mean, I think that's one reason she gets these amazing kinds of results. Now, they may be equally effective with other children who are native speakers, but you might have noticed that it took until the final year that we got growth in the native speakers of English, and I think it's hard to get children who don't have so much growth, you know, so obvious growth to show growth. The classrooms have to be really good, and across the board they have to be really good. Yeah.
I think this points to a theme that we've talked about all day, which is the curriculum paired with the ongoing professional development or learning community or chances for teachers to talk about their practice.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're saying it took these 3 years, and during that time you described they're receiving support, they're having, right?
Right, yeah, that's right, all right. Yeah, it's sustained. I mean, that's one I sort of jumped over some, but I think it has to be sustained. It's like what you're doing in Boston. It has to have sustained. It has to be a part of the culture. This is who we're doing. You have to have the resources. I mean, it just can't be you know, we're going to, all 4th graders are going to be readers by, you know, whatever, and then we do that for 2 years, and now we do something else. You know, it doesn't work.
And you can't just buy the box.
And the box doesn't teach. Right, right. Okay, thank you very much.
Again, David would like you to remember
thank
this
you,
visit.
thank you.
And,
Okay, thank you.
Here's some children's
I can work. Yeah.
in Spanish.
Thank you, thank you. Yes.
Several years worth, and then.
Well, that's great. This is what I need here. Some children's books to help me. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Wonderful.